Hello everyone and once again welcome to my channel Economics Unplugged with Praful Raj. My name is Praful Raj. My channel is about the insightful conversation with economists and professors about the Indian and global economy. Today our special guest is Dr. Abhilasha Sahay, an economist at the Gender Group at the World Bank, where she led a portfolio of work on women's workforce participation, earning and productivity. She has previously worked at Africa General Innovation Lab and also with the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare in Government of India. Abhilasha completed her PhD in economics from George Washington University and masters from London School of Economics. So thank you so much Abhilasha for joining me for this conversation. And also, since this is a podcast which I started 2 months back, so it's named as Economics Unplugged with Praful Raj. So just for the audience, so whatever we talk here, it's an impression of Abhilasha's research and her own personal opinion and experiences, but it does not guide or any term talks anything about the research and future policies related to the World Bank, where she is currently employed. Yeah. So today we'll talk about the gender economics. Okay. So whenever we discuss about gender in a various contexts, we always think that it's about gender equality. But no, actually, however, this concept encompasses more than just talking about any striving of equal opportunity about genders. So, for example, it talks about the labor force participation, wage gaps, occupational segregation, access to education, access to healthcare, and many more entrepreneurship, division of unpaid care work between the genders like household chores and everything. Also very important, it also explore how societal norms, discrimination, institutional factors and policy frameworks shapes economics opportunity and outcome of different genders. So we'll talk more about gender economics. So she's an expert and she has done research in the field of gender economics, labor force participation. So yeah, thank you so much Abhilasha for joining it. So we can start with our first question. Like for example, like what does, according to you, field of gender economics encompasses? Like how extensive is the scope and how crucial for developing nation like especially India to concentrate and address this issue within the area of economics and development?
Great. Thanks so much for that question, and thanks for having me, Praful. It's a pleasure being here, and I'm glad that more and more discussion is happening on gender economics. So maybe I'll start with kind of the second part of your question to accordingly motivate the rest of this conversation. So gender is increasingly at the front and center of the development agenda, both among policymakers as well as researchers. There is no ambiguity in the fact that closing gender gaps is critical, not only for the fact that we for inclusive development, but also more and more importantly at a macro level. So just to give you an example, that globally, if it were the case that women were able to participate in the labor market as much as men, then the global economy could stand to gain as much as 20% increase in the long-term GDP. And this is even more salient for developing countries like India, where the analogous number would be around 56%. So a 56% increase in GDP per capita in the long term. So as you can, imagine that, ignoring gender gaps or being dismissive of it actually has very steep costs associated, right? So it's not something that is confined to one sector, but can have a very overarching impact on the overall economy. So, with that in mind, I think it is quite crucial to be focusing on gender economics, and in particular on women's economic empowerment, and including empowerment along various other dimensions. Now, to the point on, what gender economics is and, what the scope is. So as you rightly pointed out, it's not primarily about gender inequality or discrimination, but just thinking through what are the various gaps that could exist between men and women due to a range of different pre-existing differences or societal differences across a range of different human endowments, right? So your education, health,
Yeah.
skills, training, access to social protection, access to public works programs. All of these different endowments are important for any person, irrespective of gender, to reach their full potential. And those gaps, the study of those gaps is quite important to better understand how to really address them and how to close those gaps, right? And at the same time, there are, it will also entail the study on various underlying reasons or factors that could be driving these gaps, right? Some part of it, as you mentioned, could be societal norms. Some part, and especially this is important, in the South Asian context. I think norms is one of the most underpinning barriers, so to say. And but at the same time, there could be certain pre-existing differences as well, that may or may not be influenced by norms. And at the same time, institutional factors are also an important aspect that could be driving some of these gaps, and the kind of, enablers that are there in our environment, whether it's institutions or legal reforms, that could be one of the aspects. So I think everything with regard to gender gaps, right from, like, measuring the magnitude of it, understanding the reasons behind those gaps, and what are the ramification of those gaps. So the point I was trying to make earlier on, like, the impact on GDP, for instance, that's just one of the outcomes.
Yeah.
I think the study of all of these different things is would be a part of gender economics. And maybe I'll mention one more thing, because this is, I feel it's important for audiences and some of your listeners to know that gender economics still as a field is something that it's a growing body of work. It is still finding its place on the map. I have been a student of economics for more than a decade now. I did my PhD in development economics. Until date, you don't really have like a specific subfield with the designation of gender economics. It would easily get bucketed. So the study on gender would get bucketed under development economics or labor economics. So everything to do with employment, jobs, etc. But I think increasingly, as more and more people like you and I pursue the study of gender, it will become, more at the front and center as a discipline as well, which is very critical, which is very important in today's day and age.
Yeah, I think you rightly mentioned 2, 3 points, and it's quite correlated. For example, if the new gender economics area has been introduced, more and more students will go towards it. And then
Yes.
there'll be various development. And then what you said about 56% approximately increase in GDP. So, of course, GDP is a mix of whatever we do. I think Indian government should do more about it, more than manufacturing, where we are trying to be reaching from 20% to 25% of GDP for manufacturing. So yes, also like you talk about the labor force participant, especially in India. So there is not a I would say disconnect. So basically, one of the surveys that was periodic labor force survey that is done in India, which talks that approximately 23% of women labor force is there, 22-23% in recent year surveys. But the Economic Advisory Council, of Government of India, so they are doing a research, and they told that in their research, which is a working paper, that these periodic survey does not cover the household and the other uninformal sectors. So if we add this, it will be around more than they estimated around 43-45%. So what do you think on that? Like, is it like, of course it makes sense, but to what extent it makes, does it would lead to a misleading information, like maybe something like that, making it more than it is happen? So yeah.
Right. So some part of the issue could be measurement, right? Now, globally, you would see that South Asia and India definitely being one of the major players in the subcontinent, um, it's a puzzle. Female labor force participation in South Asia is turning out to be a puzzle for the reason that despite economic growth, despite the fact that we have been over the last decades able to propel India's growth, you don't see as many strides taking place in women's economic participation. Now, a part of the reason, as some of these reports are mentioning, could be a measurement challenge. But let me also tell you that that measurement challenge is not confined to India. Globally, the informal sector or women participating in any form of house based enterprises or household based paid work or unpaid work is not accounted for. In fact, the ILO recently came out with a revision on this, on how they are trying to, in their future modules, include additional questions on informal employment. So if I have to think about, any systematic differences in measurement that are taking place, it is there globally. Despite that, you are seeing that India surfaces and South Asia surface as an outlier, where over time, in the past 3 decades, you are seeing that despite growth, women's economic participation has actually been stagnant and in some cases even declining. So that aspect is something that continues to be a puzzle. There is also a lot of scholarly work that indicates that a major aspect of this could be norms. So despite the fact that there have been more and more investments in women's education, which have translated into closing gender gaps in educational enrollment, completion, as well school and university completion, as well as performance in school and universities, that has not effectively translated into more economic opportunities for women, right? And so, that disconnect, so to say, is something that needs to be acknowledged, and it's not only it is not entirely a measurement bias. That I think it's important to acknowledge. Now, when we think of norms per se, right now, even if you have to consider the region of Middle East and North Africa, MENA. So MENA and South Asia are the two regions where norms are particularly pervasive. So norms around women's employment and women's work outside the home are especially binding in these regions. And you see that these are exactly the two regions where you have not seen as much progress on women's economic participation. And that to me doesn't seem to be like a coincidence. There has to be some correlation based off of which, this is happening. But having said that, norms are something that are malleable. They can be changed over time. There are interventions where by engaging men, partners, family members, community members, in the process of women's employment, you would see that you are able to positively impact or at least demystify some perceptions that people hold on women's work and gender roles in order to sort of increase employment and propel, women's participation in the workforce.
I mean, this norms is more like a behavioral change.
Yes,
And
exactly.
also, in short, you discussed that this measurement we're talking about, it's not the actually a measurement biases. It's actually the entire world is measuring on the same, almost on the same parameters. Okay.
Right.
So as we talked about norms and labor force participation, and you also talked about that policy to be changed. I mean, change a new policy to be implemented. So we'll talk on that also. So I'll just give a few examples like what other countries are doing and how they and how what do you think on that. So just for example, affordable and accessible childcare policies implemented by countries such as Denmark, Finland, and among others. And also, the availability of affordable childcare associated with high labor force participation, female labor force participation, and which reduces the gender gap in employment as a result also. In US, second example, some assistance for low income families through childcare and development block grant is done. For example, states like California and New York have introduced the legislation to address pay gap, promote transparency in pay. Additionally, they have also have the Equal Pay Act in 1963, which prohibits pay discrimination based on gender. I mean, there are reports which talks about, yes, there is some reduce in the gender gap. Some says that there is still a huge gap among them. So based on this, what policy intervention do you think as of now will help in India in increasing the labor force participation, especially the female one?
Right. So before we actually get into the policy interventions and the solutions to close the gender gap in economic participation in the Indian context, it's also important to understand what are the barriers to women's participation, right? And so what are the constraints that women are facing to enter the labor market and continue in the labor force? So one is the entry point, the other is the retention point. So here again, it is a multitude of barriers. There's not just only one constraint. Some of these could include, pre-existing differences in human endowment, such as your education, skills, training, right? Right from the beginning, if you're seeing that parental investments in daughters' education and skills and training is not to the fullest as compared to relative to men and boys, then you would see that there would be certain differences. At the same time, time poverty. So what do we mean by time poverty? Now, in most cultures, including India, women disproportionately face the higher burden of household as well as childcare responsibilities, including elder care responsibilities. And so, this kind of opportunity cost of participating in the market outside of home versus conducting homework is something that women have to face more than men. And then at the same time, there are several instances of gender-based violence and other forms of discrimination that women might be more vulnerable to once they enter the labor market. That can again act as a deterrence for them to be entering the labor market, right? So there is an interplay of all of these factors that could really deter women from reaching their full economic potential. So when we think of programs and interventions, it's important to design programs that not only seek to address one constraint, but can in some way address a multitude of these constraints. What we see in the empirical evidence on this topic is that if you design a program just for one specific constraint, it would not be as effective if you're not sort of accounting for the surrounding environment, or like if you're not accounting for norms, for instance.
It has to be
So I think
multidimensional in a real life.
exactly.
It's not just
So
a
having that kind of a multi-pronged, multi-dimensional approach is quite important. And this is something kind of across context. So what I'm gonna share with you a little bit is we did do a review of the empirical evidence, primarily causal evidence on what really works to increase women's labor force participation. And this was across context. And some of this is extremely relevant for India. Some of this work is also coming from the Indian context. Now, one thing that does surface to be quite important is provision of affordable, accessible, and quality childcare. So because in order to sort of address some of the time-based constraints that women may face, it is important that they have an out, they have certain services they can access to be able to engage in the labor market to their fullest potential. And it's not only about just providing these services, but also addressing norms associated with outsourcing childcare, right? Now, even though if I have a mobile creche at home, if say my husband and my parents-in-law are not aligned with this decision that I should be parking my child at a mobile creche and going to work, then it is a moot point. So being able to sort of acknowledge those norms and influence those norms, it's important. Now, the second point I want to make is that we are in the process of a transition and transformation. So structural transformation, this entire change that is happening from, say, agriculture to manufacturing to services. And at the same time, more and more economies are undergoing the green transition with increasing pressures of climate change. It's important to acknowledge where the new jobs are going to be, which are the sectors that are going to shape the future of jobs? And how can we equip women with the right set of skills and training to really thrive in those job markets, right? And because of these pre-existing differences between men and women, it's important to kind of have programs that are targeted towards women to equip them even more
Yeah.
than men, right? And especially, I think, young men and women. I think it's very important as they are the ones who are shaping the future of jobs. So providing, training in digital skills to be able to take on jobs in the digital economy. At the same time, we find very promising evidence if on providing skills in socio emotional skills. So these could be more skills on the soft side, such as personal initiative, negotiation, communication. As more and more jobs are surfacing in the service sector, you would see that it has to be a combination of both like hard technical skills as well as certain soft socio-emotional skills that are important for knowledge workers to have in order to thrive in the labor market. And then, again, on the sort of more demand and job creation side, we do find evidence from some public works programs. For instance, the NREGA program, we do see evidence that by with the introduction of NREGA, there was a relative increase in women's labor supply compared to men. And then again, in more other low, middle, and income countries, we again find similar evidence that public works and employment guarantee programs, especially for sort of lower socioeconomic status groups, is extremely effective in being able to boost female labor supply. Although it is also important to acknowledge that this kind of a guarantee is not necessarily leading to long-term implications. They're more short-term, but in several instances, they can provide the required impetus for women to participate, and they really catch on by getting the skills they need to sustain themselves in the labor market. So it has to be a combination of all of these different sort of supply demand side, more at the more sort of general equilibrium level, also having certain economic reforms that can really boost women's economic participation.
I think from the answer, what I think or what I realized that okay, government is doing its own stuff. So probably we more talk about norms, and it is, we know that there is a norm issues in India. So probably there's a line like everyone or charity begins at home. So probably if we as individuals start giving our women right, and remove this norms of like, oh, you can park your child or whatever, then I think it will be more from the both side. Demand will also be there, supply will also be there, and once there will be only demand when there will be supply. If there is no supply, people probably will like, government alone cannot actually work on it.
Exactly, right. So I'll just to sort of follow up on that, you're right. So I'll just mention two quick points here. So, one is when we think of all of these legal reforms, right, what the government is doing, and this is not something sort of new or a eureka moment. The government has been invested in this agenda for a while. But legal reforms in itself are not sufficient. What the adequate socialization and communication of these reforms, which is which is aligned with at the micro level what the household is thinking, what the community is thinking, is really, really important. A lot of the evidence that we see on like parental leave policies or flex work policies is primarily coming from high income countries who may not be subject to the same set of norms that low and middle income countries are. And so, I think adjusting for that in context adaptability is very important. You cannot copy paste something that happened in Denmark or Finland for the reason that it needs to be adapted, right? It needs to be adapted in our contextual, in the contextual dynamic here. The second point on demand and supply. So, one example that I always give is that an increase in demand for women's labor can instigate and can spur an increase in supply as well. And here there are two examples. One is, so this entire sort of emergence of the BPO industry, the business process and outsourcing call center jobs, we did see that with, providing the right set of training to women to take on these call center jobs, there was an increase in women's economic participation in those like specific labor markets. There's a paper by Robert Jensen from UPenn in 2012, where in Rajasthan they see that it not only did increase, participation at that point in time, but in the long term, it increased sort of women's age of marriage or childbearing, right? So also pushing out some of these other outcomes, socioeconomic outcomes that are important to women. Another example is the Bangladesh garment industry, right? Because there was an increase in demand for women labor in the new garment industry, then that led to an increase in supply as well. So this interplay between demand and supply is very important, alongside the legal reforms and other institutional reforms that governments could provide.
Yeah, it's like a both of a gradual casualty that we take anyway. Both demand and supply should be there about that. So we talked about labor force participation. So basically, we are mainly focusing about a woman or a girl 18 plus, because we talk about maternity act and everything, and also the child care. But what about the girl who is like below 18? Like, so there is Beti Bachao, Beti Padhao. There are other few also. I think they have been into government has been introducing for this. But do you think like, what I think personally, that education is very important, talking about the enrollment, first of all enrollment, which Beti Bachao Beti Padhao has seen some of the enrollment, and also like less drop rates over the years. But do you think that we need to prioritize and implement more such policies and interventions that target about empowerment and inclusion of young female who less than 18 years old, or the girl who are not we are not restricting the age probably, but who are not ready to go for labor, for participation in labor force, what education, healthcare, that is very, I don't think so we have been focusing a lot the younger girls.
Right. So now I think it is important to have like a whole of life cycle approach, right? So I wouldn't even limit it to say girls below the age of 18, but I think some forms of discrimination may just start when, girls are not even born, right? So we have so many instances of female feticide and female infanticide in India. And so when we think of, government programs or just investments in how to really close these gender gaps, it has to be a sort of whole of life cycle approach.
Yeah.
So right from, stage of infancy, in terms of access to the right healthcare, nutrition, food, all of that is, as I said at the beginning of our conversation, that these are some critical human endowments that we need to really reach our full potential in life. And so just at the most fundamental stages, we need to have investments to close these gaps at the endowment level. And then, of course, I think, as you mentioned, some of these programs have been able to achieve the desired outcomes, such as Beti Bachao, Beti Padhao. Then there have been certain programs also to sort of, reduce the incidence of son preference, which can, I think when you get a signal of this nature from the government, that or even if it's in the form of like providing financial incentives, like if a girl is born, providing some financial incentive for her education or health, that is a strong signal to the people, to the citizens, that we don't have to view the girl as a liability. She can also be an economic asset, right? All of this is like the motivations of all of these norms is also economic at the end of the day, right? I mean, India is again a country where patriarchality is the norm. So post-marriage, if if the girl is going to the husband's family, yes, all of your investments in her education and health, one may think that okay, it's going away. So what's the point? But again, I think being able to influence those norms, being able to showcase how girls and boys are both sort of assets for parents is important. So yeah, I think, to your question, of course, it's important to prioritize young women who are still in the process of getting educated. And in this, I think there has been some evidence from Latin America and Caribbean where these kind of student employment programs, right? So while you're still in university, through being able to get certain apprenticeship or internship programs, you're able to really build your employable skills to enter and thrive in the labor market. And that has really helped young girls as well.
Yeah, I mean, it requires investments. Like the one of the problem that women faces of any age, that we think that uh, unless she takes care of household things, child, or she gets money. So I think the opportunity cost of a scaling of 18-20 years, that is one of the reason probably impeding people, sending them for study and education, like probably just be at this age and go marriage and or whatever like that. I think this is one of the reason we need money. Investment is required in that sector.
Yeah.
So with all that, one of the very important that one of your research also, which talk about the most palpable manifestation of gender inequality. So you have done on the research on gender-based violence. So could you tell more about your paper on, like, the paper which you wrote, which is known as the silenced woman, can public stimulate reporting of violence against women? So if you could talk about that paper and like what are the reasons that actually uh, stopping girls or women to come in front, and what are the reasons and the findings from it?
Sure. So this paper on the silenced women, can public activism stimulate reporting of violence against women? This is part of my PhD dissertation, where I was again focusing entirely on gender. And here, so one of the key research questions was to see whether an increase in information and sensitization on violence against women can actually stimulate reporting, which means, by getting more women to report any instances of violence they may have faced. So now globally, violence against women is alarmingly pervasive. 1 in 3 women have experienced some form of violence in their lifetime. That's a very big number. However, if we look at the number or proportion of these women who may have actually gone ahead and reported these instances formally to, say, police services or the medical services, that proportion is only 7%. So only 7% of women are actually going ahead, reporting these cases formally and seeking justice. Now, this problem of underreporting of violence, it's not only a numbers issue. What happens with underreporting is that if we know that certain cases will not get reported, it again perpetuates more violence. So as a perpetrator, if I know that I would get away with something and nothing, and not face any penalties or actions against my act, there is a tendency to perpetuate more and more of such
It will keep
things.
happening because the person
Exactly.
does not have any fear of
Yeah.
anything.
So that deterrence effect is largely undermined. So, given this, the complexity between incidents and reporting of gender-based violence, I was intrigued to see, okay, what really works? What are some interventions or changes that can enable more women to come forward and report instances of violence? And so in particular, what I do is I investigate the aftermath of the 2012 Delhi gang rape incident that took place. I'm certain several of your listeners would be aware of this incident. It was one of the most heinous acts of violence against women happening in the heart of Delhi in a public place. And what instigated, what really happened after this incident was like a series of protests and demonstrations, getting thousands of men and women together to protest against this act, and fight for the survivor in this, for the victim in this case, and quite critically, it demanded a structural change in how we as a nation deal with and tackle crimes against women. So what the motivation of this research was to see that as a result of these increase in protests and sensitization on cases of violence against women, do we see any changes happening with regard to reporting of cases? And what I see is, what I find, I use an array of different econometric techniques, using a difference in difference technique to estimate what was the impact of these protests. And what I find is that after these protests, there is a 27% increase in reported cases of violence against women, which includes, rape, kidnapping, sexual assault, sexual insult, and dowry deaths. And at the same time, there is, I don't find any change in gender neutral crimes, which were kind of like the placebo crimes, such as, say, murder or any such economic offenses. And I think what was more important in this paper was to understand the mechanisms behind this, right? So is this an increase in occurrence of crimes, or is it an increase of, like, it is triggered by more women coming forward and reporting? And that's an important empirical challenge in studying gender-based violence for sort of any researcher. And in order to do that, I use like FIR data, which is very detailed, to see whether there was any difference between the date a crime got reported and the date the crime occurred. So in some way, this gap of the lag in reporting is used as a proxy for, say, reporting bias. And what we do see is that after this incident, you see a higher proportion of cases being reported with lesser lag, and the number of days of lag also reduces. So just, and again, because it's a key empirical challenge on, how you can't really observe what's happening and, what's getting reported. So this is a proxy to at least suggestively show that a major part of this increase in reported cases of violence against women could be attributed to increase in survivor disclosure. So with these, protests that were taking place, more and more dialogue, even on like news channels. So there was a very bottom-up approach that was taking place, and communities, people were talking about it. And so that could have really emboldened more women to come forward and report these instances. And it's quite similar to the global Me Too movement that took place. And of course, that was much later. I think that started sometime in 2015, 2016. This was a thing that the case that happened in 2012. But that's pretty much the mechanism underlying what was happening. And one thing that did come out of this research as an important policy implication was that often, when we think of gender-based violence, a lot of the focus is more on like institutional reforms. So let's say having all women police stations or all women justice centers. But at the same time, it's important to sort of address this, in a more bottom-up manner by having community-based discussions where gender-based violence is more systematically integrated, so as to even, reduce or address the norms associated with gender-based violence. Why do women not go forward and report? There are, like, again, a range of different factors. There's a lot of stigma and shame associated with being a victim of violence. There is distrust of institutions, that there's no point, even if I go forward and report, there is no point to.
Yes, correct.
Right. And then again, at the same time, there could be other a factor such as, fear of the perpetrator, especially if the perpetrator is known to you. So I think in 90% of the cases, the perpetrator could be someone who you know. It could be an intimate partner, it could be a colleague, it could be your landlord. So there is a fear associated with that. And then at the same time, several women may face certain financial or informational barriers. So in order to address some of these barriers to reporting, if we can systematically integrate this at the community level, then I think that's one way to not only reduce the risk and incidence of violence, but also stimulate reporting among women. And it's very important to also engage men in these conversations. That we can possibly not find any transformative changes without engaging men.
Yes, because I mean, we both are the part of society. So instead of telling them, I think it is now important, because whenever we talk about gender, it's more like women should come forward, women should know. But at the same time, the other approach, the second side, is that we should also come telling that you should go, like something like we should also be known. I will while I'll post it on LinkedIn or talk about that, I'll also tell specifically that instead of women watching this what happening, I think men should also watch this video more, I would say.
Yeah.
Watch in a more proportionate and think about it what is happening, so then at least that you said the perpetrator, that is one of the important reason. I mean, men will understand what is happening within our community, within our families, which is very very common in India, which is happening. So coming to that point, that you highlighted the factors such as fear of discrimination, fear of perception, distrust, and one of the reasons is that females may hesitate to report such event, contributing to, system is also responsibility of the system, as you mentioned, the police officer being female and all. So do you think that this lack of support is coming from parents, or like, parents should be the first person who should know about it? Do you think that parents can here play an important role, and their support is very important before any system, any community, any police comes into the picture? And like, how to educate parents also, this is very important.
Yes. So I would actually say that, it's difficult to kind of pinpoint on one specific stakeholder or one specific relationship, such as, parental relationship. It has to be a more of a whole of society approach. Now, it really depends on the demographic we are looking at. If we are thinking of young unmarried women who have faced something of this nature, it's likely that maybe their parents are the ones who are the closest to them. But in certain instances, it could be like a friend or a colleague who they may find is someone who they can confide in, right? So I think it's when we are thinking of this at a policy level, it's important to have a more comprehensive, overarching approach, because especially with gender-based violence, the complexity of this is it's not something that is between the perpetrator and the victim, but the bystander behavior. Everyone related to the victim, everyone related to the perpetrator, all of their circles are also important when we think of the risks and the reporting of these cases. So when we are, as I mentioned, like having that kind of a bottom-up approach, where at a community level we are able to institutionalize conversations and discussions on gender-based violence, that can be an effective model to be able to move the needle and create some change. And this isn't something that requires a lot of investment. And I repeatedly have said this at multiple platforms, that look at the example of, like, in public health and education, for instance. We have community health workers, we have ASHA workers, we have Anganwadi workers who have been working round the clock to, in a very bottom-up manner at the community level, to lead to desired progress in education and health. And that model is something that has worked. So we don't even have to create lots of investments in this to get GBV at the front end. We can use these existing mechanisms, and ASHA and Anganwadi workers, for instance, can really be a part of that, at least informal reporting process for women who may not have other known members with whom they can confine. Because again, confidentiality is again a very important aspect of
That's
gender-based
so.
violence. I
Yes.
might actually feel more comfortable sharing this with someone who's complete stranger to me, rather than someone with whom I share an interpersonal relationship, an emotional relationship. So I think that, is something that can be sort of institutionalized at the policy level. I do know that there are certain states and communities who are doing this, but it just needs to happen more systematically.
I mean, society surrounding has to come forward, not just parents or any relation.
Yes, exactly.
So, I mean, this is a topic which is kind of interesting and also the sad to discuss all these things. But I think by seeing this video, many people will probably, if one female or male changes stories, I think that would be great. And now it's time to talk more about it. Not just few people, but everyone should talk about it. So this was one of my initiative towards it. So concluding this conversation, Abhilasha, if you could just conclude in 2 3 sentences, like what to all women, like what message do you give to all women, all females, girls, young girls, and of any age? It can, things can happen at age of 50, 60, not just only a young woman. So yeah, what's your final conclusion on that?
So, I've always said this, especially to kind of, women who may reach out, who are pursuing economics or sort of any other field, that often sometimes the constraints that we think we are facing, we might be imposing it on ourselves. So it's important to, have, sort of your
Courage.
head and heart set in the right place, having that courage to kind of to pursue whatever dream you have, whether it is on the academic front, something on the creative side. And because often you may always surprise yourself in your journey, and when you look back, you realize that you had some form of passion or desire but did not pursue it for XYZ reasons. And so those XYZ reasons can change through your life cycle, and the people who are around you will also change through your life cycle. But what is your constant is you. So really kind of having that faith in yourself and belief in yourself, and just going forward with that is important. And along the way, I'm certain, and I consider myself to be kind of very privileged and very empowered, that along the way I've found various mentors, and both men and women, who have helped me in my journey. And so it's literally just about sort of reaching out, just hand waving, and then you will find someone who is able to kind of guide you and navigate that process for you, because there are always others who have been able to navigate it before you in some of the other fields. So I think this is also an outreach to young or old women who are pursuing their dreams, especially in the field of economics, that if you have any questions, any form of advice that I could provide, please feel free to reach out. I think if that is a message I can send across through this channel, that would be great.
Great, thank you so much. I think of course people will listen and probably reach out to you. So that, thank you so much, Abhilasha, for joining this. Thank you.